In a quiet valley surrounded by snow-dusted mountains, there stood a shop no one remembered building. It had crooked windows, warm golden light, and a hand-painted sign that simply read, Reed Co., Clockmaker of Lost Time. Every evening, when the last traces of daylight sank behind the hills, a faint glow shimmered through the glass, like candlelight moving on its own. The villagers said the clockmaker never aged, that he'd been there before their grandparents were born, and that his clocks didn't just tell time, they remembered it. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of oil and pine. Dozens of clocks lined the shelves, tall, tiny, round, square, each one ticking in perfect harmony. The clockmaker, Mr. Reed, worked silently under a hanging lamp. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were bright, reflecting every spark of the gears he polished. He kept a journal beside him, filled with names and dates. Each name matched a clock, and each clock held a single moment someone wished they could return to. When people came to him, they didn't ask for timepieces. They asked for forgiveness, for memory, for peace. And he would nod softly and say, "Time can't be undone, but it can be remembered kindly." He'd build a clock for them, and when it was wound for the first time, it would replay one beautiful memory they'd lost. Only once. One winter night, a little girl named Mara knocked on the shop door. Her coat was torn, and she held a single button in her hand from her mother's old coat. "Sir," she whispered, "can you make me a clock that sounds like her laugh?" Mr. Reed paused. He hadn't made a clock like that in years, but something in her eyes, the kind of sadness that only belonged to someone too young to understand loss, made him nod. He placed the button on his desk, wound a small silver gear, and said softly, "Come back when the first snow melts. Time needs to breathe before it remembers." Weeks passed. Snow fell thick across the valley, and the village lights dimmed early. Mr. Reed worked night after night, his tools whispering against brass. He hummed softly, a lullaby he'd forgotten the words to. Sometimes, when the lamplight flickered, he'd hear faint laughter echoing in the workshop, gentle, warm, like a memory slipping between ticking seconds. He smiled. The clock was almost ready, but when he wrote in his journal that night, he hesitated over one thing. Under Mara, he left the space beside date of return blank. Spring came late that year, and when the snow finally melted, Mara didn't return. Instead, a woman in a long gray coat entered the shop. She looked at the rows of clocks, her eyes glistening. "You made one for my daughter, didn't you?" Mr. Reed froze. "Your daughter?" The woman nodded. "Mara passed away that winter. She used to listen to the clocks outside your window, said they sounded like dreams." The air grew still. The only sound was the synchronized ticking of 100 memories. The woman placed a small locket on the counter. "She wanted you to have this," she whispered. Inside was a faded photograph of a young boy standing beside a much younger version of Mr. Reed. It was his brother. That night, Mr. Reed wound the last clock he would ever make. It was smaller than the others, carved from silver and pearl, with a glass face that glowed faintly blue. When he turned the key, the hands began to move, and a laugh filled the room, light, bright, and familiar. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he wasn't an old man surrounded by ticking time. He was a boy again, standing in a field of snow with his brother, watching the stars turn overhead. And when the laugh faded, so did the light inside the shop. The clocks all stopped, perfectly in sync. By morning, The door to Reed Co. hung open, letting in the first rays of dawn. The villagers found the workshop empty, except for one silver clock, still ticking softly. On its back, engraved in tiny letters, were the words, "Time can't be undone, but it can be remembered kindly." And if you listen closely, on quiet nights when the wind passes through the valley, you can still hear the faint ticking of 100 clocks, each keeping time not for the living, but for the memories they left behind.